They stood around my grandmother's mahogany dining table like vultures circling fresh carrion, each clutching a piece of paper that supposedly gave them the right to strip away everything I'd ever known and loved. My cousin Bradley held up Grandma Rose's pearl necklace, the one she'd worn to every family gathering for 40 years, and announced to the crowded living room, "This should cover what Emma owes us for all those years we supported her." But what none of them knew, what they couldn't have possibly imagined as they divided up my inheritance like spoils of war, was that hidden behind a loose brick in the basement wall was a safety deposit box key that would change everything. And when my Uncle Richard finally discovered what was really in that box, the very people who had spent the morning calling me a burden were about to learn that they'd just stolen from the wrong person. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Catherine Sullivan, and this story isn't just about a family estate sale gone wrong. It's about what happens when people who've spent years making you feel like you don't belong suddenly realize you were the only one who truly belonged there all along. Let me take you back to that cold October morning in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, when everything I thought I knew about my family and my place in it was about to be turned completely upside down. I'd been living with my grandmother Rose since I was 12 years old, after my parents died in a car accident on Interstate 80 during a winter storm. Rose Sullivan wasn't just my grandmother, she was my everything. The woman who taught me to bake her famous apple cinnamon bread, who helped me with algebra homework at her kitchen table, who sat with me through every teenage heartbreak and celebrated every small victory. For 15 years, that Victorian house on Maple Street had been my sanctuary, my home, my world. Rose had always been different from the rest of the Sullivan family. While my uncles Richard and Thomas built their construction businesses and accumulated wealth, Rose volunteered at the local animal shelter and spent her evenings reading to children at the public library. While my cousins Bradley and Jessica focused on climbing social ladders and impressing their country club friends, Rose and I would spend Saturday mornings at the farmers market, talking to every vendor about their families and their stories. She taught me that wealth wasn't about what you owned, but about how you treated people and what you contributed to your community. The Sullivan family had always made it clear that I was an outsider, a charity case they'd been forced to take in. During family gatherings, I was the one who helped serve dinner, while my cousins sat at the adult table. When graduation announcements went out, mine was printed on regular paper, while Bradley and Jessica's were embossed with gold lettering. When college time came around, my uncles made it clear that I'd be responsible for my own education, while their children received full tuition payments and monthly allowances. But Rose never made me feel like a burden. She celebrated my acceptance to Millbrook Community College with the same enthusiasm she showed for everything else in my life. When I graduated with honors and got a job as a social worker at the County Children's Services office, she framed my diploma and hung it in her living room, right next to her collection of family photographs. When I saved enough money to take her on a long weekend trip to Cape Cod for her 80th birthday, she cried tears of joy and told everyone at the grocery store about our adventure for months afterward. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Rose had been sick for 6 months before she passed. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed far too late to do anything meaningful about it. I'd taken leave from my job to care for her during those final months, sleeping in the guest room down the hall from her bedroom, making sure she took her medications, driving her to every doctor's appointment, and holding her hand through the worst of the chemotherapy sessions. My uncles visited occasionally, usually bringing their wives and children for awkward 30-minute conversations, where they'd ask about her will and her assets more than they asked about her comfort or her pain. During those last weeks, Rose had become increasingly insistent about showing me where she kept important documents. She'd led me through the house, pointing out where she stored birth certificates, insurance policies, and bank statements. She showed me the combination to her bedroom safe and made me promise to remember the location of various items that held sentimental value. But there was one thing she'd been particularly secretive about, something she'd mentioned only once during a morphine-induced conversation about hidden treasures and family secrets that I'd assumed was just the medication talking. The morning Rose passed away, I'd called my uncles from the hospital. They arrived within hours, not to comfort me or to make funeral arrangements, but to start discussing the estate. While I sat in the hospital parking lot, Still processing the reality that the most important person in my life was gone, Richard and Thomas were already making phone calls to lawyers and estate sale companies. By the time we returned to the house that evening, they'd already begun going through Rose's belongings, making lists and taking photographs of anything that looked valuable. The funeral was held on a Tuesday at St. Mary's Catholic Church, the same church where Rose had attended Mass every Sunday for 60 years. The service was beautiful, filled with stories from her friends and neighbors about her kindness, her generosity, and her unwavering commitment to helping others. But even during the eulogy, I could see my uncles checking their phones and whispering to their wives about logistics and timelines. They weren't mourning Rose, they were waiting for her to be buried, so they could get on with the business of dividing up her assets. The reading of the will took place the following Friday in the conference room of Morrison, Patterson and Associates, the law firm that had handled Rose's legal affairs for 30 years. I sat across the polished conference table from my uncles and their families, feeling like an intruder in my own family's business. The lawyer, an elderly man named Harold Morrison who'd known Rose since they were children, seemed uncomfortable as he opened the manila folder containing her final wishes. Rose's will was straightforward in most respects. The house and its contents were to be divided equally among her 3 surviving relatives, her 2 sons, Richard and Thomas, and her granddaughter, Emma. Her bank accounts, which totaled approximately $43,000, were to be split the same way. Her personal effects were to be distributed according to a separate document that she'd prepared, with specific items designated for specific people. It seemed fair, even generous, considering that I wasn't technically her biological descendant in the same way her sons were. But that's when Richard dropped the first bomb. He cleared his throat and pulled out a folder of his own, filled with documents and receipts and carefully organized financial records. He explained that over the past 15 years, he and Thomas had been covering various expenses related to Rose's care and my upbringing. Medical bills that weren't covered by insurance, home maintenance costs that Rose couldn't afford, educational expenses that they'd supposedly helped with, and ongoing support for what he called my living expenses while I was growing up. According to Richard's calculations, these expenses totaled nearly $67,000. With interest calculated at what he claimed was a fair market rate, my portion of the inheritance was not only eliminated, but I actually owed the family money. The house would need to be sold to cover these debts, and any proceeds would go to Richard and Thomas to reimburse them for their years of financial support. I sat there in stunned silence as Harold Morrison reviewed the documents. Everything was legal, properly documented, and apparently enforceable. The medical bills were real, the home repairs had actually been completed, and the educational expenses had indeed been paid to various institutions over the years. What Richard and Thomas had done was essentially loan money to Rose for my care and upbringing, with the understanding that these loans would be repaid from her estate upon her death. The cruelest part was the itemization. They'd charged Rose for groceries that fed me, utilities that covered my presence in the house, clothing allowances, school supplies, and even birthday and Christmas gifts. Every act of basic human decency, every small kindness, every moment of family inclusion had been secretly tallied up and converted into a debt that would eventually be collected from Rose's estate. I was quite literally being charged for the privilege of having been raised by my own grandmother. Thomas, who'd remained quiet during most of the meeting, finally spoke up to address what he called the practical realities of the situation. The house needed to be cleaned out and prepared for sale as quickly as possible. An estate sale company had already been contacted and would arrive the following Monday to assess the contents and prepare for a weekend sale. I would have until Sunday evening to remove any personal belongings that held sentimental value, but anything left in the house after that point would become part of the estate sale inventory. The whole thing felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart in slow motion. In the span of 1 week, I'd lost my grandmother, learned that my family had been secretly billing her for my existence, discovered that I'd inherited debt instead of assets, and been told that I had 5 days to remove 15 years of memories from the only home I'd ever really known. That weekend, I moved through Rose's house like a ghost, trying to decide what I could reasonably take with me to my small apartment across town. My job as a social worker paid enough to cover basic living expenses, but I had no savings, no family support, and now no safety net of any kind. I took Rose's recipe collection, a few photographs, some of her books, and a handful of jewelry pieces that held sentimental value. Everything else, all the furniture and household items and decorative objects that had made that house a home, would be sold to strangers. Monday morning arrived with the estate sale crew, a team of efficient professionals who moved through the house with clipboards and price tags, reducing Rose's lifetime of memories to lots and inventory numbers. They were polite but impersonal, treating Rose's belongings like merchandise rather than cherished possessions. I watched them wrap her china in newspaper and stack her books in cardboard boxes, feeling like I was witnessing the erasure of everything that had mattered to her. The sale was scheduled for the following Saturday and Sunday, with a preview day on Friday for serious collectors and dealers. Richard and Thomas would handle all the logistics and keep any proceeds after expenses. I wasn't expected to participate or even attend, which was probably for the best since I couldn't imagine watching strangers paw through Rose's belongings while my uncles counted money in the background. But Friday evening, unable to stay away, I drove past the house and saw cars lining Maple Street. The estate sale was already in full swing, with people carrying boxes and furniture out to their vehicles under the supervision of Richard and his wife Margaret. The sight of Rose's rocking chair, the one where she'd held me during thunderstorms when I was 12 years old, being loaded into a stranger's pickup truck was almost more than I could bear. That's when I decided to go inside, just one more time, to say goodbye to the house properly. I used the key Rose had given me years earlier, the one I'd never returned, because she'd insisted I keep it in case of emergencies. The house was chaos, with rooms stripped of furniture and personal belongings scattered across tables with price tags attached. People were walking through Rose's bedroom, examining her jewelry, and discussing the quality of her linens. Strangers were opening her kitchen cabinets and commenting on the value of her dishes and glassware. I made my way to the basement, the one place in the house that had always been Rose's private domain. She'd used it as a combination workshop and storage area, with shelves full of craft supplies, holiday decorations, and boxes of photographs and documents that chronicled decades of family history. The estate sale people had obviously been down there, but the basement was too cluttered and disorganized to attract much buyer interest. Most of the items down there would probably end up being donated or thrown away. That's when I remembered Rose's strange comment during one of our last conversations. She'd been heavily medicated and drifting in and out of consciousness, but she'd suddenly grabbed my hand and told me about a loose brick behind the water heater. She'd said something about keeping important things safe from people who wouldn't understand their value. At the time, I'd assumed she was hallucinating or confusing past and present, but standing in that basement surrounded by the remnants of her life, I decided to look for that loose brick. The basement wall behind the water heater was old fieldstone, the kind of construction typical of houses built in the 1920s. Most of the stones were solid and immovable, mortared in place decades earlier. But, in the corner, about 3 feet from the floor, I found a stone that shifted slightly when I pressed against it. Working carefully, I was able to remove the stone completely, revealing a small cavity that had been deliberately created in the wall. Inside the cavity was a metal box about the size of a paperback book, wrapped in plastic and secured with a simple latch. My hands were shaking as I opened it, not knowing what to expect but feeling like I was violating some sacred trust by exploring Rose's secret hiding place. The box contained a key, a small brass key with a number stamped on it that I recognized as the type used for safety deposit boxes. There was also a handwritten note in Rose's careful cursive, addressed to me specifically. The note was brief but clear. Rose had maintained a safety deposit box at Millbrook Savings and Trust for over 20 years. The contents of that box were meant for me, and only me, to be accessed after her death. She'd hidden the key because she knew that Richard and Thomas would try to claim anything of value as part of the estate, and she wanted to make sure that at least one thing would remain beyond their reach. The note ended with an instruction that I was to go to the bank alone, tell no one about the key, and remember that she'd always believed I deserved better than what the rest of the family was willing to give me. I sat on Rose's basement floor, holding that key and reading her note over and over again, while strangers walked around upstairs dividing up everything she'd owned. For the first time since her death, I felt a connection to her that transcended all the legal documents and family politics. She'd known exactly what would happen after she was gone, and she'd taken steps to protect something important from the people who would never understand its true value. The bank was closed until Monday, which meant I had an entire weekend to wonder what Rose had considered important enough to hide from her own family. I spent Saturday at home, deliberately avoiding the estate sale and trying not to think about Rose's furniture and belongings being sold to strangers. Sunday was even worse, knowing that by evening the house would be completely empty and ready for the real estate market. Monday morning, I was waiting outside Millbrook Savings and Trust when they opened at 9 o'clock. I presented the key and my identification to a bank employee who led me to a small, private room where safety deposit boxes could be accessed. Box 247 was larger than I'd expected, roughly the size of a shoebox, and when the bank employee left me alone to examine its contents, I felt the same nervous anticipation I'd experienced in Rose's basement. The first thing I found was money, not just a few bills but stacks of hundreds and fifties, neatly organized and held together with rubber bands. There was more cash in that box than I'd ever seen in one place, and a quick count revealed approximately $37,000. But there was more than money. The box also contained documents, photographs, and a thick manila envelope sealed with tape and marked with my name in Rose's handwriting. The photographs were old, some dating back to the 1940s and 1950s, showing Rose as a young woman with people I didn't recognize. But as I studied them more carefully, I began to see familiar features in some of the faces. There was a man who looked remarkably like my father, and a woman whose smile reminded me of my own reflection. These weren't random family photographs. They were pictures of my biological grandparents, my father's parents, people who died when I was too young to remember them clearly. The documents in the box told a story I'd never heard before. My father, Daniel Sullivan, hadn't been Rose's biological son. He'd been adopted by Rose and her late husband Patrick when he was 16 years old, after his own parents died in a house fire. The adoption papers were all there, along with correspondence between Rose and various social services agencies, and medical records documenting my father's recovery from injuries sustained in the fire that killed his family. But the most shocking revelation was in the sealed envelope marked with my name. Inside were more legal documents, including a copy of a will that I'd never seen before. Not Rose's will, but the will of my biological great-grandfather, a man named William Hawthorne, who died when I was 8 years old. According to this will, William Hawthorne had left his entire estate to his great-granddaughter Emma Catherine Sullivan to be held in trust until her 27th birthday. The trust documents were complex, filled with legal language that I didn't fully understand, but the basic facts were clear. William Hawthorne had been a successful businessman who'd built a small empire of rental properties and commercial real estate throughout Pennsylvania and New York. When he died, his estate was valued at over $2.4 million. All of it had been left to me, his only surviving descendant, with Rose appointed as the trustee responsible for managing the assets until I came of age. My 27th birthday was next month. According to the trust documents, Rose had been receiving quarterly reports from the law firm managing the estate, and the investments had grown substantially over the past 19 years. The most recent statement, dated just 3 months before Rose's death, showed the trust value at over $4.7 million. In 32 days, I would become one of the wealthiest people in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. But there was more. Rose had also been keeping detailed records of every expense that Richard and Thomas had charged to her estate for my care and upbringing. She'd known about their secret accounting system all along, and she'd been documenting everything with the help of Harold Morrison, her attorney. Every fraudulent charge, every inflated expense, every instance where they'd billed Rose for things they'd never actually paid for, was meticulously recorded and cross-referenced with bank statements and receipts. The real story was even worse than I'd imagined. Richard and Thomas hadn't been supporting Rose financially. They'd been systematically stealing from her, using my presence in the house as justification for charging her for expenses they'd never incurred. They'd billed her for my medical expenses while I was covered by her insurance. They'd charged her for educational costs that had actually been paid by scholarships and grants. They'd even billed her for groceries and utilities that they claimed were above normal usage, despite the fact that they'd never contributed a penny to Rose's household expenses. The total amount of fraudulent charges over 15 years was $67,000, exactly the amount they were now claiming I owed to the estate. But Rose had proof that none of these expenses had actually been paid by Richard and Thomas. They'd created an elaborate fictional narrative about supporting my upbringing, documented it carefully, and planned to use it to steal my inheritance after Rose's death. Sitting in that small bank room, surrounded by documents and photographs and more money than I'd ever imagined having, I finally understood why Rose had been so secretive about the trust. She'd known that Richard and Thomas would try to claim any assets they could find, and she'd taken steps to protect the inheritance that rightfully belonged to me. But she'd also gathered evidence of their fraud, preparing for a battle that she wouldn't live to fight herself. There was one more item in the safety deposit box, a letter from Rose written just weeks before her death. In it, she explained that she'd always known about William Hawthorne's trust, and she'd spent 19 years protecting it from people who would have found ways to steal it from me. She'd watched Richard and Thomas become increasingly greedy and manipulative as they got older, and she'd realized that they would stop at nothing to claim any assets they could identify. By keeping the trust secret, she'd ensured that I would inherit what was rightfully mine, free from their interference. But Rose's letter also contained a warning and a challenge. She'd written that money without wisdom was dangerous, and that true wealth came from understanding how to use resources to help others and build something meaningful. She'd challenged me to think carefully about how I wanted to use the inheritance, and she'd expressed her hope that I would find ways to honor William Hawthorne's memory by continuing his tradition of investing in community development and supporting people who needed help. I left the bank that morning with my head spinning and my heart pounding. In the span of 2 hours, I'd gone from being a broke social worker with no family support to being a millionaire with the power to completely transform my life and the lives of others. But more importantly, I discovered that the woman who'd raised me had been protecting me and fighting for me, even when I didn't know a battle was being waged. The first thing I did was call Harold Morrison, Rose's attorney, and arrange an emergency meeting. Harold was a gentleman in his 70s who'd known my family for decades, and when I arrived at his office with the trust documents and evidence of Richard and Thomas's fraud, his reaction was a mixture of relief and righteous anger. He'd suspected for years that something wasn't right about the expenses being charged to Rose's estate, but he'd never been able to prove anything. Harold explained that the trust would become active on my 27th birthday, which was still 3 weeks away. Until then, the assets remained under the management of the firm that had been handling them since William Hawthorne's death. But once I reached the age specified in the trust, I would have complete control over the inheritance, and I could use it however I saw fit. More importantly, Harold had been working with Rose to document Richard and Thomas's fraudulent activities, and he had enough evidence to pursue both civil and criminal charges against them. The estate sale proceeds from Rose's house and belongings could be recovered, and additional damages could be sought for the emotional distress and financial hardship their actions had caused. But Harold also warned me that pursuing legal action would mean exposing the trust and my inheritance to my family, which would fundamentally change all our relationships forever. Once Richard and Thomas learned that I was worth nearly $5 million, they would undoubtedly try to find ways to claim some of those assets for themselves. I would need to be prepared for a level of manipulation and family drama that could last for years. I spent the next 2 weeks thinking carefully about my options and planning my next moves. I could quietly accept my inheritance, move away from Millbrook and start a new life somewhere else without ever confronting Richard and Thomas about their fraud. I could pursue legal action and recover Rose's stolen assets while exposing their crimes to the world. Or I could find a middle ground that would give me justice while protecting myself from ongoing family conflict. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Rose hadn't just left me money. She'd left me the power to choose who I wanted to be, and how I wanted to handle people who had tried to take advantage of my vulnerability. The trust wasn't just about financial security. It was about having the resources to stand up for myself and to protect others who might find themselves in similar situations. But first, I wanted to see exactly how far Richard and Thomas were willing to go with their deception. The estate sale had ended, Rose's house had been cleared out, and they were proceeding with their plan to sell the property and keep all the proceeds for themselves. They still believed that I owed money to the estate, and they were actively working to make sure I would never see a penny of Rose's legacy. So I decided to let them continue with their plan, while I prepared for the most satisfying confrontation of my life. Because in 18 days, when I turned 27 and officially became the beneficiary of William Hawthorne's trust, I was going to teach Richard and Thomas Sullivan exactly what it felt like to underestimate the wrong person. The next morning, I sat in my tiny apartment kitchen drinking coffee from a chipped mug that I'd rescued from Rose's house, staring at photocopies of trust documents that would change everything in 17 days. The contrast was almost laughable. Here I was, living paycheck to paycheck in a one-bedroom apartment with a leaky faucet and outdated appliances, while secretly being worth more money than most people in Millbrook would see in several lifetimes. But what struck me most wasn't the money itself. It was the realization that Rose had been carrying this enormous secret for 19 years, protecting an inheritance that my own family would have destroyed if they'd known about it. I called in sick to work that Tuesday, something I'd never done unless I was actually bedridden with fever. My supervisor, Janet Rodriguez, was understanding about my need for bereavement time, but I couldn't exactly explain that I needed mental health days to process becoming a secret millionaire. Instead, I spent the morning walking through downtown Millbrook, seeing my childhood town through completely different eyes. The struggling businesses that I'd always felt sorry for, the community center that desperately needed renovation, the homeless shelter where I'd volunteered during college, they all looked different when viewed through the lens of someone who might actually have the resources to make a meaningful difference. But I also found myself studying every interaction differently. The barista at Corner Coffee, who'd always been friendly to me, was she genuinely nice, or was she just being polite to a regular customer? The bank teller who'd helped me access the safety deposit box, had she treated me with the same respect she'd show to someone she knew was wealthy? I was beginning to understand something that I'd never considered before: how much of people's behavior toward you is influenced by their perception of your worth and status. That afternoon, I drove past Rose's house on Maple Street. The for sale sign was already posted in the front yard, and the entire property looked sad and abandoned. The gardens that Rose had lovingly maintained for decades were already showing signs of neglect, and the windows that had always been filled with her plants and decorations now stared out blank and empty. Seeing the house like that, stripped of everything that had made it a home, made me realize that Richard and Thomas weren't just stealing money from Rose's estate. They were erasing her memory, turning the place where she'd built a life into just another piece of real estate to be flipped for profit. I parked across the street and sat in my car for nearly an hour, watching neighbors walk by the house with sad expressions. Mrs. Peterson from next door had loved Rose like a sister, and they'd shared coffee on Rose's front porch every Wednesday morning for 20 years. Mr. Chen from the corner house had relied on Rose to watch his mail when he traveled, and she'd helped his wife with English lessons when they first moved to America. These people had lost more than just a neighbor when Rose died. They'd lost someone who'd been a cornerstone of their community, and now they were watching her home get commoditized by family members who'd never appreciated what she meant to the neighborhood. That evening, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. I called Margaret Sullivan, Richard's wife, and asked if I could meet with her privately. Margaret had always been the most approachable member of my extended family, and while she'd never gone out of her way to include me in family activities, she'd also never been actively cruel the way Richard and Thomas sometimes were. If anyone in the family might be willing to listen to reason, it would be Margaret. We met at a small restaurant on the outskirts of town, a place where we were unlikely to run into other family members or mutual acquaintances. Margaret looked uncomfortable from the moment she sat down, clearly unsure why I'd requested this meeting. She ordered a salad and spent the first 10 minutes making small talk about her youngest daughter's college applications and her part-time job at the library. I could tell she was waiting for me to explain what I wanted, probably expecting me to beg for some kind of mercy regarding the estate debts or to ask for help finding a place to live. Finally, I decided to take a direct approach. I told Margaret that I'd discovered some irregularities in the expense claims that Richard and Thomas had submitted regarding my upbringing, and I wanted to give the family an opportunity to address these issues privately before involving lawyers or authorities. I kept my voice calm and professional. the same tone I used when conducting interviews for child welfare cases at work. Margaret's expression shifted from confusion to concern to something that looked almost like fear. Margaret admitted that she'd always been uncomfortable with the way Richard had been documenting expenses related to my care. She'd questioned him several times about whether it was appropriate to charge Rose for things like birthday gifts and Christmas presents, but Richard had insisted that everything needed to be properly accounted for, since Rose's estate would eventually need to reimburse them for the financial support they'd provided over the years. Margaret had assumed that this was normal protocol for families dealing with informal guardianship arrangements. But as we talked further, Margaret revealed details that made Richard's fraud even more disturbing than I'd initially realized. Richard had been inflating expenses and billing Rose for costs that didn't exist. The $10,000 he'd claimed for my high school education had actually been covered entirely by an academic scholarship that I'd earned through my grades and community service. The $15,000 he'd charged for college expenses had mostly been paid through grants and student aid that I'd applied for myself. Even the medical bills he'd submitted had been largely covered by Rose's insurance, with only minimal out-of-pocket costs that Rose had paid directly. Margaret seemed genuinely shocked as she began to understand the scope of Richard's deception. She'd trusted her husband's accounting and assumed that the expenses were legitimate. She'd even felt proud that their family had been able to provide financial support for Rose and me during difficult times. Learning that Richard had been systematically stealing from his own mother while creating fictional narratives about their generosity was clearly devastating for her. I showed Margaret some of the documentation that Rose had compiled, photocopies of bank statements and receipts that proved Richard's expense claims were false. Margaret studied the papers with growing horror, occasionally covering her mouth with her hand or shaking her head in disbelief. By the end of our conversation, she was crying, not just from embarrassment but from genuine grief about what her husband had done to Rose during her final years. Margaret promised me that she would confront Richard about the fraudulent expenses and demand that he make things right. She also warned me that Richard had been discussing plans to challenge Rose's will if I tried to claim any inheritance, and that he'd been consulting with lawyers about ways to prove that Rose wasn't mentally competent when she'd made decisions about her estate. Margaret clearly had no idea about the trust, but her information about Richard's legal strategies was valuable intelligence for my own planning. The next day, I received a phone call from Thomas's wife, Linda, asking if we could meet for coffee. Word was clearly spreading through the family that I'd been asking questions about the estate expenses, and Linda wanted to do damage control before I involved outside authorities. Linda was different from Margaret, more calculating and defensive, clearly more aligned with her husband's perspective on family finances and inheritance matters. Linda's approach was to minimize the significance of any accounting irregularities, while emphasizing how much the family had sacrificed to help Rose care for me over the years. She talked about the emotional burden of having a grieving child in the family, the disruption to their own children's lives, and the ongoing responsibility they'd felt for my welfare even as adults with their own families to support. According to Linda, any financial compensation they'd received from Rose's estate was minimal compared to what they'd actually contributed in terms of time, energy, and emotional support. I listened to Linda's justifications with growing amazement at her ability to reframe theft as martyrdom. She genuinely seemed to believe that charging Rose for fictional expenses was morally acceptable, because the family had provided real value in other ways. When I pointed out specific instances where Richard and Thomas had billed Rose for expenses they'd never actually incurred, Linda dismissed these as minor accounting errors that didn't reflect the larger pattern of family support. But Linda also revealed something that chilled me to the bone. She mentioned that Richard and Thomas had been going through Rose's personal papers and financial records, looking for any assets that might not have been properly disclosed during the estate proceedings. They'd found some old bank statements that referenced accounts and investments they couldn't locate, and they were working with a private investigator to track down any hidden assets that might be part of the estate. My heart was pounding as I realized how close Richard and Thomas were coming to discovering the trust. If they found any paperwork that referenced William Hawthorne or the law firm managing the trust assets, they would undoubtedly find ways to challenge my inheritance or claim portions of it for themselves. I needed to accelerate my timeline and confront them before they uncovered information that could complicate everything. That weekend, I drove to Philadelphia to meet with the lawyers who'd been managing William Hawthorne's trust for nearly 2 decades. The firm of Blackwood, Stevens & Associates occupied 3 floors of a downtown high-rise, and their offices were a world away from Harold Morrison's small-town practice in Millbrook. The attorney handling my trust, a woman named Patricia Blackwood, was probably in her 50s, impeccably dressed and clearly accustomed to dealing with substantial inheritances and complex family dynamics. Patricia had been expecting this meeting since Rose's death, and she'd already prepared all the paperwork that would transfer control of the trust to me on my 27th birthday. She walked me through the portfolio in detail, explaining how the investments had been managed and how the assets had grown over nearly 2 decades. William Hawthorne's original bequest of $2.4 million had been invested conservatively but effectively, with a focus on real estate, municipal bonds, and blue-chip stocks that provided steady growth and reliable income. The current value of the trust was actually higher than the most recent statement I'd seen. With quarterly dividends and capital gains from several property sales, the total assets were now approaching $5.2 million. Patricia explained that I would have complete discretion over how to manage these assets once the trust transferred to my control, but she strongly recommended maintaining the conservative investment approach that had been so successful over the past 19 years. More importantly, Patricia had been coordinating with Harold Morrison regarding the evidence of fraud that Rose had been documenting. The law firm had resources and expertise that Harold's small practice couldn't match, and they were prepared to pursue both civil and criminal charges against Richard and Thomas if I decided to move forward with legal action. Patricia estimated that we could recover the full value of Rose's estate, plus substantial damages for fraudulent theft and elder abuse. But Patricia also warned me about the complexities of family inheritance disputes, especially when substantial assets were involved. Even with overwhelming evidence of fraud, legal proceedings could take years to resolve, and Richard and Thomas would undoubtedly hire attorneys who would use every possible strategy to delay and complicate the process. More concerning, once my inheritance became public knowledge, I could expect ongoing attempts by various family members to claim portions of the trust or to manipulate me into providing financial support for their own projects and expenses. I spent most of that Sunday in Philadelphia, walking through the city and thinking about the decision I needed to make. I could continue living quietly, accept my inheritance when it became available, and move away from Millbrook without ever confronting Richard and Thomas about their theft. This would give me financial security and freedom, but it would also mean that they'd gotten away with stealing from Rose, and would likely continue exploiting other vulnerable family members in the future. Alternatively, I could pursue full legal action, exposing their crimes and recovering Rose's stolen assets while making it clear that their behavior had consequences. This would provide justice for Rose and might prevent them from victimizing others. But it would also mean years of legal battles and family drama that could overshadow any positive use I might make of my inheritance. But there was a third option, one that appealed to both my desire for justice and my practical understanding of family dynamics. I could confront Richard and Thomas directly, revealing my knowledge of their fraud and my upcoming inheritance, and give them an opportunity to make things right voluntarily. This approach would allow me to control the narrative and timeline, while still maintaining the option of legal action if they refused to cooperate. The more I thought about this third option, the more it appealed to me. Rose had spent 19 years protecting my inheritance from people who would have stolen it, and she'd documented their crimes meticulously so that I would have the power to seek justice. But she'd also taught me that true strength came from using power wisely, and that the best victories were ones that created positive change rather than just satisfying desires for revenge. I decided to give Richard and Thomas one chance to do the right thing voluntarily. If they were willing to acknowledge their theft, return the stolen assets, and make a genuine apology for their treatment of Rose, I would be willing to resolve things privately, without involving law enforcement or pursuing additional damages. But if they continued to deny their crimes, or attempted to manipulate the situation, I would use every resource at my disposal to expose their fraud and ensure they faced appropriate consequences. Monday morning, I called both Richard and Thomas and asked them to meet with me that evening at Rose's house. I told them that I'd discovered some important information about the estate that needed to be discussed before the house sale proceeded. Both men sounded irritated about having to accommodate my schedule, but they agreed to the meeting, probably expecting me to make some desperate plea for mercy regarding the debts they claimed I owed. I spent Monday afternoon at Rose's house, walking through the empty rooms and remembering all the moments of happiness and security I'd experienced there. The house felt hollow and sad without Rose's furniture and personal belongings, but it also felt like neutral ground for the confrontation I was planning. This was where Rose had raised me, where she'd protected me, and where she'd kept the secret that would ultimately give me the power to stand up to the people who'd taken advantage of her kindness. Richard and Thomas arrived together at 7 o'clock, both carrying briefcases and looking like they were prepared for a business meeting rather than a family discussion. They'd clearly coordinated their approach, probably planning to present a united front and pressure me into accepting their version of the estate settlement. Richard did most of the talking initially, explaining that they'd been reviewing the timeline for the house sale and wanted to make sure I understood the final accounting of estate debts and assets. I let them present their case completely, listening as Richard detailed the $67,000 in expenses they were claiming, and Thomas explained how the house sale proceeds would be applied to cover these debts. They spoke about me as if I wasn't in the room, referring to the costs of raising me and the burden I'd placed on Rose's limited resources. Their tone was paternalistic and condescending, as if they were doing me a favor by explaining financial realities that were beyond my understanding. When they finished their presentation, I pulled out my own folder of documents. I started with the bank statements and receipts that proved their expense claims were fabricated, laying them out on Rose's kitchen counter and walking them through each fraudulent charge. Richard's face went pale as he realized how thoroughly his theft had been documented, while Thomas became increasingly defensive and argumentative. But the real shock came when I revealed the trust documents and explained about my upcoming inheritance. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Richard literally stumbled backward and had to grab the kitchen counter for support, while Thomas's mouth fell open and stayed that way for several seconds. They'd spent weeks planning how to steal $67,000 from what they thought was a broke social worker, only to discover that they'd been targeting someone who was about to inherit over $5 million. The panic in their eyes was immediate and unmistakable. They realized that they hadn't just committed fraud against Rose, they'd committed fraud against someone who now had the resources to pursue serious legal consequences. Richard started stammering about misunderstandings and accounting errors, while Thomas began making aggressive demands to see proof that the trust documents were authentic. I explained that I had two ways I could handle this situation. The easy way would involve them voluntarily returning all the money they'd stolen from Rose's estate, providing written apologies for their fraud, and agreeing to ongoing restitution for the emotional damage they'd caused. The hard way would involve criminal charges, civil lawsuits, and public exposure of their systematic theft from their own elderly mother. The next 30 minutes were unlike anything I'd ever experienced. These two men, who had spent my entire life making me feel small and powerless, were suddenly begging me for mercy and trying to negotiate terms for their own protection. Richard offered to return the estate sale proceeds immediately, while Thomas promised to provide documentation of the real expenses versus the fabricated ones. Both men swore that they'd never intended to hurt Rose, and that they'd only been trying to ensure fair compensation for the family support they'd provided. But their desperation also revealed the depth of their selfishness and manipulation. Even while apologizing, they continued to justify their actions and minimize the harm they'd caused. Richard insisted that they genuinely believed they were entitled to compensation for raising me, while Thomas argued that Rose would have wanted them to benefit financially from their years of sacrifice and support. I realized that they weren't apologizing because they understood the moral wrongness of their actions. They were apologizing because they'd been caught and were afraid of the consequences. This wasn't genuine remorse, it was damage control. And that understanding changed everything about how I wanted to handle the situation. I told Richard and Thomas that I would give them 48 hours to decide how they wanted to proceed. They could either provide full restitution and written admissions of guilt, or they could face the legal and social consequences of their choices. But whatever they decided, they needed to understand that I was no longer the powerless charity case they'd been manipulating for decades. I was someone with resources, evidence, and the determination to ensure that Rose's memory was honored properly. As I watched them leave Rose's house that night, I felt something I'd never experienced before in my relationship with my family. I felt powerful. Not because of the money, although that certainly helped, but because I finally understood my own worth, independently of their approval or acceptance. Rose had given me more than financial security. She'd given me the tools to stand up for myself, and the confidence to demand the respect I deserved. 12 days until my 27th birthday. 12 days until the trust became official and my life changed forever. But the real transformation had already begun the moment I decided to stop accepting less than I deserved and start fighting for what was right. The 48 hours I'd given Richard and Thomas felt like the longest 2 days of my life. I went to work on Tuesday and Wednesday, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy while my phone buzzed constantly with calls and messages from various family members. Word had clearly spread through the Sullivan clan that something significant was happening, though I doubted anyone knew the full scope of what Richard and Thomas were facing. Margaret called me Tuesday evening, her voice shaky and desperate. She explained that Richard had been pacing around their house like a caged animal, alternating between rage and panic. He'd hired a lawyer to review the trust documents I'd shown them, and the attorney had confirmed that everything was legitimate and legally binding. Margaret begged me to consider some kind of payment plan that would allow Richard to return the stolen money gradually rather than all at once, explaining that they didn't have $67,000 in liquid assets available for immediate restitution. What struck me most about Margaret's call was her complete focus on Richard's predicament rather than any acknowledgement of what he'd done to Rose. She talked about the financial strain this would place on their family, the embarrassment it would cause in their social circles, and the potential impact on their daughter's college plans. But she never once mentioned Rose's suffering or expressed genuine remorse for the years of systematic theft that had occurred under her own roof. Linda's approach was entirely different. When she called Wednesday morning, her tone was aggressive and accusatory. She demanded to know why I was threatening the family with legal action instead of working things out privately like reasonable people. According to Linda, the expense claims that Richard and Thomas had submitted were legitimate representations of the real costs of raising me, and any minor discrepancies were honest mistakes, rather than deliberate fraud. She insisted that I was being vindictive and ungrateful, using my unexpected inheritance as a weapon against people who'd sacrificed for my welfare throughout my childhood. Linda also made it clear that the family was prepared to fight me in court if necessary. She claimed they had documentation proving that Rose had been suffering from dementia during her final years, which would call into question her mental capacity when she'd made decisions about hiding assets and documenting supposed fraud. Linda warned me that challenging the family would result in years of expensive litigation that would consume much of my inheritance and expose embarrassing details about my upbringing to public scrutiny. But the most disturbing call came from my cousin Bradley on Wednesday evening. Bradley had always been the golden child of the family, the successful businessman who'd inherited his father's construction company and expanded it into a regional operation. His approach was to position himself as a neutral mediator who could help resolve the conflict between his parents and me without involving lawyers or authorities. Bradley explained that he'd reviewed the financial documents and agreed that some of the expense claims appeared to be inflated or inaccurate. However, he argued that these discrepancies reflected poor record-keeping rather than intentional fraud, and that the appropriate remedy was financial restitution rather than criminal charges. He offered to personally guarantee repayment of the questionable expenses over a 5-year period, with interest, if I would agree to resolve the matter privately and avoid pursuing legal action against Richard and Thomas. What made Bradley's offer particularly manipulative was how he framed it as being in my own best interests. He pointed out that public exposure of family financial disputes would damage my reputation in Millbrook's tight-knit community, especially since I worked in social services where trust and discretion were essential professional qualities. He also suggested that my sudden wealth would make me a target for people who might try to take advantage of my inexperience with managing large sums of money, and that maintaining family relationships would provide important support and guidance, as I learned to handle my new circumstances. But Bradley's real agenda became clear when he started asking detailed questions about the trust structure and the investment portfolio. He wanted to know which law firm was managing the assets, how the money was invested, and whether there were any restrictions on how I could use the inheritance. His questions were clearly designed to gather intelligence that could be used to challenge the trust or find ways to claim portions of it for other family members. I listened to all these calls and considered all these offers, but what struck me most was the complete absence of genuine accountability or remorse from anyone in my family. They were all focused on damage control and self-preservation, rather than acknowledging the fundamental wrongness of what Richard and Thomas had done to Rose. Even Margaret, who seemed the most genuinely distressed by the situation, was primarily concerned about protecting her husband from consequences, rather than ensuring justice for Rose. Thursday morning arrived without any direct communication from Richard or Thomas themselves. I'd expected them to contact me personally to discuss terms or make counteroffers, but they'd apparently decided to work through intermediaries and family pressure rather than face me directly. This told me everything I needed to know about their level of remorse and their commitment to making things right. At 10 o'clock Thursday morning, I called Patricia Blackwood in Philadelphia and authorized her to begin preparing both civil and criminal complaints against Richard and Thomas Sullivan. I also asked her to coordinate with Harold Morrison to ensure that Rose's estate would be properly restored and that any proceeds from the house sale would be recovered. Patricia assured me that her firm had extensive experience with elder abuse cases and that the evidence Rose had compiled would make this a relatively straightforward prosecution. But I also asked Patricia to delay filing the complaints until after my birthday the following week. I wanted to officially receive my inheritance before exposing the family conflict, partly for legal protection, but mostly because I wanted to enjoy a few days of financial security before dealing with the chaos that would inevitably follow. Patricia agreed to this timeline and promised to have all the paperwork ready for immediate filing once I gave the final authorization. Thursday afternoon, I drove to Rose's house one last time before the real estate closing that was scheduled for the following week. The property looked even more abandoned than before, with dried leaves scattered across the front porch and the gardens beginning to show serious signs of neglect. I used my key to enter the house and walked through the empty rooms, remembering all the moments of love and security I'd experienced there. Standing in Rose's bedroom, looking out the window at the garden where she'd taught me to plant vegetables and identify wildflowers, I made a decision that surprised even me. I pulled out my phone and called the real estate agent handling the sale, a woman named Carol Henderson, who'd known Rose for years and had seemed genuinely sad about having to list the property. I explained to Carol that there had been some complications with the estate that would prevent the sale from proceeding as planned. I told her that new assets had been discovered that would change the distribution of Rose's estate, and that the house would need to be removed from the market pending resolution of these issues. Carol was confused but cooperative, especially when I offered to pay any cancellation fees or commission costs that might result from withdrawing the listing. What I didn't tell Carol was that I was planning to buy Rose's house myself once my inheritance became official. I couldn't bear the thought of strangers living in the place where Rose had created so many loving memories, and I had ideas for how the property could be used to honor her memory while serving the Millbrook community. But first, I needed to deal with Richard and Thomas and make it clear that their theft would have real consequences. Friday morning, I called Richard directly and informed him that his 48 hours had expired without any satisfactory response. I told him that I would be pursuing full legal action against both him and Thomas, including criminal charges for elder abuse and civil suits for recovery of stolen assets plus damages. Richard's voice was barely a whisper as he asked for more time to gather the money for restitution, but I explained that the time for voluntary cooperation had passed. Richard then made one final attempt at manipulation, appealing to my emotions about family unity and Rose's memory. He claimed that Rose wouldn't have wanted the family to be torn apart by legal battles and financial disputes, and that she would have preferred for us to work things out privately through forgiveness and understanding. According to Richard, pursuing criminal charges would dishonor Rose's legacy of kindness and bring shame to the family name that she'd worked so hard to build in the community. I listened to Richard's plea with a mixture of anger and amazement at his continued self-deception. He was trying to use Rose's memory to protect himself from the consequences of stealing from her, apparently believing that I would prioritize family harmony over justice for the woman who'd raised me. His complete inability to understand the moral dimensions of his actions confirmed that I'd made the right decision in refusing to accept his hollow apologies and inadequate offers of restitution. But I also realized that Richard's call was likely being recorded, probably on the advice of whatever attorney he'd consulted. He was trying to create evidence that he'd attempted to resolve the matter amicably, and that I was being unreasonable in my demands for accountability. This confirmed my suspicion that Richard and Thomas were preparing for a legal battle, rather than genuinely seeking to make amends for their actions. That evening, I received an unexpected visit from Jessica, my cousin who'd always been treated as the princess of the family. Jessica was Bradley's younger sister, a successful marketing executive who'd maintained her distance from family drama throughout our childhood, but who'd clearly been recruited to make one final attempt at persuasion. She arrived at my apartment with flowers and a bottle of wine, acting as if this was a social visit, rather than a calculated intervention. Jessica's approach was more sophisticated than the others had been. She acknowledged that Richard and Thomas had made serious mistakes in their handling of estate, finances, and she expressed genuine sympathy for the position I'd been placed in as a result of their poor decisions. She talked about how much Rose had loved me, and how proud she would have been of my professional success and personal integrity throughout this difficult situation. But Jessica's real message was about the importance of maintaining family relationships, despite the financial disputes that had arisen. She pointed out that Richard and Thomas were getting older, and that family grudges could prevent healing and reconciliation that might be possible in the future. She also suggested that my sudden wealth gave me the power to be magnanimous and forgiving in ways that would demonstrate true strength and maturity. Jessica's visit lasted over 2 hours, and she was clearly prepared to invest significant time and energy in changing my mind about pursuing legal action. She shared family stories I'd never heard before, talked about Rose's role as a peacemaker during previous family conflicts, and painted a picture of how wonderful it would be if I could use my inheritance to bring the family together, rather than drive them apart through litigation and public scandal. What made Jessica's appeal particularly effective was her obvious sincerity about wanting family harmony. Unlike the others, she wasn't primarily motivated by self-interest or fear of consequences. She genuinely believed that forgiveness and reconciliation were better outcomes than justice and accountability, and she was willing to invest her own time and reputation in pursuing that goal. But Jessica also revealed information that confirmed my worst suspicions about the family's true motivations. She mentioned that Richard and Thomas had been discussing the possibility of challenging the trust in court, arguing that William Hawthorne's will was outdated and that the inheritance should be distributed among all his living descendants rather than given entirely to me. They'd apparently consulted with lawyers about claiming that the trust violated modern principles of estate distribution and that other family members had legitimate claims to portions of the assets. Jessica seemed unaware of how damaging this information was to her own cause. She was trying to demonstrate that the family wanted to work things out amicably, but she was actually revealing that Richard and Thomas were already planning to steal my inheritance through legal challenges, rather than accepting responsibility for their own crimes. This confirmed that their earlier offers of restitution and apology had been strategic manipulations, rather than genuine attempts at making amends. After Jessica left, I sat in my apartment thinking about everything I'd learned over the past week. My family's response to being caught in systematic fraud had been to deny, minimize, deflect, and threaten, rather than acknowledge wrongdoing and seek genuine redemption. They were more concerned about protecting themselves from consequences than about honoring Rose's memory or treating me with basic respect and honesty. More importantly, they were already planning to challenge my inheritance, which meant that showing mercy now would only encourage them to pursue more aggressive attacks on my financial security in the future. If I didn't establish clear boundaries and consequences now, I would spend the rest of my life dealing with manipulation, guilt trips, and legal challenges from people who viewed my inheritance as something they deserved to share. Monday would be my 27th birthday, and the trust would officially transfer to my control. But I'd already made my decision about how to handle Richard and Thomas. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people is to ensure they face the consequences of their choices, especially when those choices involve exploiting vulnerable family members. Rose had protected me for 19 years, and now it was time for me to protect her memory and ensure that her sacrifices hadn't been in vain. Monday morning arrived crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that Rose had always loved for her morning walks through downtown Millbrook. I woke up in my small apartment, knowing that by evening, I would officially be worth over $5 million, but more importantly, I would finally have the power to seek justice for the woman who had given me everything while asking for nothing in return. At 9 o'clock sharp, I walked into the offices of Blackwood, Stevens and Associates in Philadelphia, carrying nothing but my identification and the key that Rose had hidden behind that loose brick in her basement wall. Patricia Blackwood was waiting for me with a conference room full of documents, investment portfolios, and legal paperwork that would formally transfer control of William Hawthorne's trust from the management firm to me personally. The signing process took nearly 2 hours, with Patricia explaining each document and ensuring that I understood the full scope of my new financial responsibilities. The trust assets included not just cash and securities, but also 6 rental properties in Pennsylvania and New York, a small office building in downtown Philadelphia, and shares in several local businesses that William Hawthorne had invested in decades earlier. The total value was actually higher than Patricia had initially estimated, approaching $4 million when all assets were properly valued. But the most meaningful moment came when Patricia handed me a sealed envelope that William Hawthorne had left specifically for me, to be opened only when I officially inherited his estate. Inside was a handwritten letter from my great-grandfather, a man I'd never met, but who had somehow understood that I would need his support and guidance decades after his death. William's letter was brief but powerful. He wrote about the importance of using wealth responsibly, about the obligation that comes with financial security to help others who face the kinds of struggles he'd experienced as a young man building his business from nothing. He also wrote about his regret that he'd never had the chance to know me personally, but his confidence that Rose would raise me to be someone worthy of the trust he was placing in my hands. Most importantly, William's letter contained specific instructions about how he hoped the inheritance would be used. He wanted portions of the estate to support education for young people who couldn't afford college, housing assistance for families facing eviction or foreclosure, and business loans for entrepreneurs who had good ideas but couldn't access traditional financing. He'd structured the trust to provide me with complete discretion over these charitable activities, but he'd expressed his hope that I would honor his vision of using wealth to create opportunities for others. Reading William's letter in that Philadelphia conference room, I felt a connection to family history that I'd never experienced before. This was more than just an inheritance, it was a legacy of community service and social responsibility that had been preserved for me through Rose's careful stewardship over nearly 2 decades. The money would give me financial security, but the real gift was the opportunity to continue William's work of using resources to help people who needed support and encouragement. By noon, all the paperwork was complete, and I was officially in control of the trust assets. Patricia walked me through the immediate practical steps I needed to take, including setting up new bank accounts, reviewing insurance coverage, and deciding whether to maintain the current investment strategy or make changes based on my own financial goals. She also provided me with contact information for tax attorneys, estate planners, and investment advisors who could help me manage the complexities of sudden wealth. But before leaving Philadelphia, I had one more important task to complete. I authorized Patricia to file both civil and criminal complaints against Richard and Thomas Sullivan, providing her with all the documentation that Rose had compiled over the years, plus the additional evidence that had emerged during my recent conversations with family members. Patricia assured me that the cases were extremely strong and that recovery of the stolen assets plus damages would be virtually certain. The criminal charges included elder abuse, fraud, and theft, all felonies that could result in significant prison time if Richard and Thomas were convicted. The civil suits would seek recovery of the $67,000 they'd stolen from Rose's estate, plus additional damages for emotional distress, punitive damages for their systematic exploitation of an elderly family member, and legal fees associated with pursuing justice. But Patricia also filed one additional legal action that I'd requested specifically. We petitioned the court to have Rose's house removed from the real estate market and placed in temporary legal protection pending resolution of the estate fraud. This would prevent Richard and Thomas from benefiting from the house sale while they were facing criminal charges for stealing from Rose's estate. Driving back to Millbrook that afternoon, I felt a strange mixture of excitement and nervousness about what would happen next. By evening, Richard and Thomas would know that criminal charges had been filed against them. By tomorrow, the news would be spreading through Millbrook's close-knit community. By the end of the week, everyone who had known Rose would understand exactly how her own sons had betrayed her trust during her final years. I stopped at Corner Coffee downtown and ordered a large coffee with extra cream, the same order I'd been making for years when money was tight and I had to stretch every dollar. The barista, a young man named Jake who'd always been friendly to me, made casual conversation about the weather and the upcoming Halloween decorations that local businesses were starting to display. He had no idea that the customer he was serving had just become one of the wealthiest people in town. But what struck me most about that ordinary interaction was how normal it felt. Despite everything that had changed about my circumstances, I was still the same person who cared about treating service workers with respect, who enjoyed simple pleasures like good coffee and changing seasons, and who felt most comfortable in the familiar surroundings of the town where Rose had raised me. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, my phone started ringing. The first call was from Margaret, crying and barely coherent, as she tried to explain that police officers had just served Richard with arrest warrants and legal papers. She begged me to call off the prosecution, promising that Richard would do anything I wanted if I would just stop the criminal proceedings before they destroyed his reputation and his business. The second call came from Linda, screaming and cursing as she accused me of destroying the family out of spite and greed. According to Linda, I was using my inheritance to get revenge on people who had sacrificed for my welfare, and I would regret my vindictive actions when I realized how much I'd lost by alienating the only family I had. The third call was from Bradley, attempting to maintain his role as the reasonable family mediator, even as his father faced criminal prosecution. Bradley informed me that the family had hired criminal defense attorneys and that they were prepared to fight the charges aggressively. He warned me that the legal proceedings would expose embarrassing details about my childhood and that I would end up spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees to pursue cases that might not result in convictions. But the most interesting call came from Harold Morrison, Rose's attorney, who had been contacted by reporters from the Millbrook Gazette about the criminal charges against Richard and Thomas Sullivan. The story was already becoming public knowledge, and Harold wanted to coordinate our media strategy to ensure that Rose's reputation was protected while the truth about the estate fraud became widely known. By evening, I'd received over 30 phone calls and text messages from family members, family friends, former classmates, and even some of my coworkers who had heard about the criminal charges through Millbrook's efficient gossip network. Most of these contacts were fishing for information or trying to understand my role in the legal proceedings, but a few were genuinely supportive messages from people who had loved Rose and were glad to see justice being pursued. The most meaningful message came from Mrs. Peterson, Rose's elderly neighbor who had shared coffee with her every Wednesday morning for 20 years. Mrs. Peterson had heard about the charges against Richard and Thomas, and she wanted me to know that she'd always suspected something wasn't right about how they treated Rose during her final years. She offered to testify about anything she'd witnessed if it would help ensure that Rose's memory was properly honored. Sitting in my apartment that evening, surrounded by legal documents and financial portfolios that represented my new reality, I realized that the real transformation wasn't about the money. It was about finally understanding my own worth and having the resources to demand the respect that Rose had always believed I deserved. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to accept being treated as less than I was worth, and I didn't have to be grateful for scraps of affection and approval from people who should have been celebrating my presence in their lives. The next morning's Millbrook Gazette would feature a front-page story about the criminal charges against 2 prominent local businessmen for elder abuse and estate fraud. But more importantly, it would tell the story of a woman named Rose Sullivan, who had spent her final years documenting the systematic theft committed by her own sons, and a granddaughter who had honored her memory by ensuring that justice was finally served. 3 years later, I stood in the renovated living room of Rose's house, now officially renamed the Rose Sullivan Community Center, watching a group of teenage students receive their college scholarship awards. The mahogany dining table where my cousins had once divided up what they thought was my inheritance now served as a desk where young people could get help with college applications and financial aid forms. Richard and Thomas had both pleaded guilty to elder abuse and fraud charges, receiving sentences of 18 months in prison and 5 years of probation. The civil suits had recovered not just the $67,000 they'd stolen, but an additional $200,000 in damages and legal fees. Richard's construction business had collapsed completely, while Thomas had been forced to sell his house to pay restitution. But the real victory wasn't their punishment. It was the community center that Rose's house had become, serving exactly the kind of people she'd spent her life helping. The William Hawthorne Educational Foundation, which I'd established using a portion of my inheritance, had already provided college scholarships to 43 students who couldn't otherwise afford higher education. The Housing Assistance Program had prevented 12 families from losing their homes to foreclosure, and the Small Business Loan Fund had helped 7 entrepreneurs start companies that were now employing over 30 people. Margaret had eventually apologized sincerely, admitting that she'd suspected Richard's accounting was dishonest but had been too afraid to confront him. She now volunteered at the community center every Tuesday, helping with the literacy program that served adults who were learning to read. Linda had moved to Florida and never spoke to me again, which was honestly a relief. The most surprising reconciliation had come from Jessica, who had initially been recruited to pressure me into dropping the charges. After learning the full scope of what Richard and Thomas had done to Rose, Jessica had cut ties with that side of the family entirely. She'd become one of my closest advisors on the foundation's work, using her marketing expertise to help promote our programs throughout Pennsylvania. Harold Morrison had become both my attorney and a close friend, helping me navigate the complexities of managing charitable foundations while maintaining my privacy and financial security. He often told people that Rose would have been amazed to see how her granddaughter had honored both William Hawthorne's vision and her own legacy of community service. Mrs. Peterson, now 87 years old, still came to the community center every Wednesday for what she called her coffee date with Rose's spirit. She'd sit in the same chair where Rose's rocking chair used to be, telling stories about their decades of friendship to anyone who would listen. I'd kept my job as a social worker for 2 years after inheriting the trust, wanting to maintain connections with the work I loved while learning to manage my new responsibilities. But eventually, the foundation's activities had grown large enough to require my full-time attention, and I'd transitioned into what Harold jokingly called my role as Millbrook's unofficial minister of second chances. The inheritance had given me financial security, but Rose's real gift had been teaching me that my worth wasn't determined by other people's ability to see it. I'd learned to demand respect rather than hoping for it, to set boundaries rather than accepting mistreatment, and to use my resources to create positive change rather than simply accumulating wealth. Sometimes I walked through the house in the evening after the programs had ended, imagining Rose's reaction to seeing her dining room filled with students working on homework, her kitchen serving free meals to families facing hard times, and her basement converted into a computer lab where people could learn job skills and search for employment. The girl who had once been called a burden had become someone whose work was improving hundreds of lives. The inheritance that my cousins had tried to steal had been transformed into opportunities for people who faced the same kinds of struggles I'd experienced growing up. And the woman who had protected me in life had given me the tools to protect others long after she was gone. Rose's house was filled with laughter and learning and hope again, exactly as she would have wanted. And I finally understood that the most valuable inheritance she'd given me wasn't money at all. It was the knowledge that I deserved to be treated with dignity, and the courage to insist on nothing less. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.